Behind the reception desk stood a woman in her 30s, Linda, with hair too perfect for 10 o'clock at night. Her badge gleamed, but her gaze was cold, almost hostile. Nearby, arms crossed, was the shift manager, Paul, in an expensive suit that seemed more about status than comfort. He was scrolling through his phone, oblivious to his surroundings. Robert set his suitcase down and removed his hat. His gray hair was disheveled, and stubble gave him the look of a weary traveler. He could have been a worker or a budget tourist. "Good evening. I have a reservation under the name Robert De Niro," he said quietly, but with the confidence honed over years in Hollywood. Linda shot him a quick glance, her eyes lingering on his scuffed boots and faded coat. Her lips curled into a disdainful smirk, and she didn't even touch the computer. "There's no place here for people like you," she said sharply, her voice dripping with contempt. "This is a high-class hotel, not a shelter. Try the motel on the outskirts." Robert narrowed his eyes, but kept his composure. He felt the air in the lobby grow heavy. Two guests seated by the fireplace fell silent, their eyes darting between the desk and Robert. The bartender in the corner froze, holding a glass mid-wipe. "You didn't even check the reservation," Robert said, his voice calm but laced with slight irony. "I asked for a room. Please check again." Paul, who had been silent until now, looked up from his phone and stepped to the desk. He sized Robert up from head to toe, his face radiating disgust. "Listen, old man," he said, emphasizing the words with sarcasm. "We don't let just any riffraff in here. We have respectable guests, and you look like you crawled out of a dumpster. Get out before I call security." The lobby fell deathly quiet. Linda nodded, as if endorsing Paul's words, her smirk widening. One of the guests by the fireplace coughed, but no one dared intervene. Robert stood motionless, his face impassive, but a spark flared in his eyes, the same spark that appeared in his roles when his characters were about to fight back. "No place for people like me," he repeated, his voice deepening, almost menacing, yet still controlled. "You judge a person by their clothes without knowing who they are? That's your hospitality." Paul scoffed, his arrogance only growing. "Hospitality is for those who can afford it. And you, old man, clearly aren't one of them. Get lost, or I'll make sure you're not welcome anywhere in this city." Robert nodded slowly, as if accepting the challenge. He leaned closer to the desk, his gaze piercing Paul through. "You've made a big mistake," he said quietly, "and I'm about to prove it." He pulled out his phone and dialed the number, putting it on speaker. The lobby froze, even Linda, who suddenly sensed something was wrong. A moment later, his assistant, Marge, answered. "Bobby, are you at the hotel? What's going on?" Her voice was concerned but professional. "Marge, get me Edward Klein." "Now," Robert said, not taking his eyes off Paul. Edward Klein was the CEO of the hotel chain that owned the Grand River. Paul frowned, but still held his defiant posture. Linda nervously shuffled papers on the desk, her confidence starting to crumble. Seconds later, Edward's voice came through. "Bobby, what's the emergency? I'm in London, but I can talk." Robert looked at Paul and Linda, his voice cold and precise. "Edward, I'm at the Grand River in Pittsburgh. I was just turned away because, and I quote, there's no place for people like me. My clothes, apparently, aren't up to par. They said I look like I came from a dumpster. What do you think about that?" There was a pause. Edward cleared his throat, his voice trembling with shock. "Bobby, this is nonsense. You're the owner. You bought this chain 3 years ago. Who dared say that?" The lobby was so silent you could hear a drop of water fall from the bar's faucet. Paul's face went pale, his jaw dropping. Linda pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes widening as if she'd seen a ghost. The guests by the fireplace began whispering, one letting out a soft chuckle. The bartender turned away, hiding a broad grin. Robert turned off the speaker and faced Paul. "That's right, I'm the owner," he said, his voice low, but each word hitting like a hammer. "And I won't tolerate people being humiliated because of how they look." You thought you could throw me out because you didn't know who I was? What if I was just a regular traveler? Would you have kicked them out too?" Paul stammered something incoherent, his hands shaking. Linda looked like she was about to cry. "Mr. De Niro, we didn't know," she began, but Robert raised a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know who I was. That's no excuse. You didn't just insult me. You insulted everyone you've ever turned away because of your prejudices. And we're going to fix this." He turned to Linda, his tone sharper. "Check the reservation. Now. And give me the key to the presidential suite." Linda, trembling, began typing. Her fingers barely obeyed. A minute later, she handed him a key card, avoiding eye contact. "I'm sorry, Mr. De Niro," she mumbled. "It was a mistake." Robert took the key, but didn't rush to leave. He looked at Paul, who stood with his head bowed. "Tomorrow at 8 in the morning, I want every shift worker in the conference room. We're going to talk about what respect means. And Paul, if you think your position protects you, think again." He grabbed his suitcase and headed to the elevator. The doors closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the lobby in tense silence. The guests began buzzing, their voices mingling with the crackling of the fireplace. Linda stared at the floor, and Paul looked like he'd aged a decade in minutes. The next morning, the conference room was packed with employees, from porters to cooks. Robert stood before them in a simple shirt and trousers, his gaze stern but fair. Beside him sat Clara, a young housekeeper who had tried to intervene the previous night when Paul berated Linda for her slowness. She was the only one who had dared to speak up about the available rooms. "I bought this chain because I believed hotels are places where everyone should feel welcome," Robert began, his voice cutting through the silence. "But yesterday, I was thrown out of my own hotel because I didn't meet the standards. They called me riffraff, said I looked like I came from a dumpster. And I know I'm not the first." He recounted the events without embellishment. The employees listened, some lowering their eyes, others nodding. Clara sat with her hands clasped, her face glowing with quiet pride. "I don't want to fire people," Robert continued. "I want us to change. Starting today, every guest gets the same respect, no matter what they're wearing or how much money they have. And every employee has a voice. If you see injustice, speak up. Like Clara did." He glanced at her, and she gave a faint smile. Paul, standing in the corner, looked humiliated. Robert didn't fire him, not yet. But he made it clear that his future depended on whether he could change his ways. The following weeks were intense. Robert stayed in Pittsburgh, personally overseeing the changes. He held training sessions, spoke with guests, and listened to complaints. Clara became his unofficial assistant, helping implement new standards. Linda, fearing for her job, began working with renewed dedication, trying to atone for her mistake. Paul struggled with his pride, but slowly started to listen. The Grand River Hotel came alive. Guests noticed the staff becoming friendlier, the atmosphere warmer. Local newspapers picked up the story, calling it De Niro's Revolution. Older readers, sipping their morning coffee, were enthralled. Now that's a man. He put them in their place. They saw in the story a reflection of their own struggles with prejudice, whether due to age, modest clothing, or lack of status. Robert stood by the window of his suite, looking out at Pittsburgh's lights. In his hands was a letter from Clara, a thank you for giving her a chance to be heard. He knew that changing one hotel was just the beginning. There were other properties that needed his attention. But that evening, when he refused to stay silent, had already sparked something bigger. And he was ready to take the next step. The Pittsburgh skyline glittered under a blanket of stars, but inside the Grand River Hotel, the air was thick with anticipation. Robert De Niro had turned a single humiliating encounter into a rallying cry for change, and the ripples were only beginning to spread. The story of his stand against prejudice had leaked beyond the hotel's walls, whispered among locals and amplified by social media. By morning, a small crowd of curious onlookers, mostly older Pittsburghers, drawn by the tale of a Hollywood legend taking on snobbery, had gathered outside, their breath fogging in the chilly air. Inside, the conference room buzzed with nervous energy. Employees sat in rows, some fidgeting, others whispering. Clara, the young housekeeper who had spoken up the night before, sat near the front, her hands folded but her eyes bright with purpose. Paul, the shift manager, stood at the back, his face a mix of defiance and unease. Linda, the receptionist, kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her once perfect hair now slightly askew. Robert stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable, dressed in a simple navy sweater and slacks. The man who had been dismissed as riffraff now held the room in the palm of his hand. "Let's get one thing straight," Robert began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of conviction. "This isn't about me. It's about every person who's ever walked through those doors and been made to feel less than human because of how they look, where they're from, or what they can afford. I've been in this business long enough to know that hospitality isn't just a job, it's a promise. And we've been breaking that promise." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the heating system. Outside, the crowd's murmurs drifted through the windows, a reminder that the world was watching. "I heard stories yesterday," Robert continued, his tone softening but no less firm. "From Clara, from the kitchen staff, from the bellhops. Stories about guests being turned away for no good reason. About employees being berated for speaking up. About a culture that rewards arrogance over kindness. That stops now." He turned to Clara, who straightened in her seat. "Clara told me about a woman last month, a single mother who saved for months to bring her kid here for a special weekend. She was dressed modestly, carried a worn bag. You know what happened? She was told there were no rooms and sent to a motel. The system showed availability, but the front desk made a snap judgment. That's not just bad service. That's cruelty." Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing as eyes turned to her. Paul shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed tighter. Linda's hands twisted in her lap. "So here's what's going to happen," Robert said, his voice rising with purpose. "We're rewriting the rules. Every employee will go through mandatory training on respect and inclusion. Every guest gets a fair shot, no exceptions. And if anyone thinks they can keep playing gatekeeper based on their own biases, they're out. No second chances." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged nervous glances. Paul's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "And one more thing," Robert added, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm not here to be the bad guy. I'm here to listen. If you've got ideas on how to make this place better, I want to hear them. Starting with you, Clara." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Me," she said, her voice small but steady. "Yes, you," Robert said with a faint smile. "You had the guts to speak up last night. What do you think we need?" Clara hesitated, then stood, her hands clasped in front of her. I think we need to feel like a team," she said. "Right now, it's like we're all scared of making mistakes, because we'll get yelled at. People like Paul," she glanced at him, then quickly away, "they make us feel like we're nothing. But if we could support each other, maybe we'd be better with the guests too." The room tensed. Paul's face reddened, but Robert raised a hand before he could retort. "She's right," Robert said. "A team that's afraid isn't a team. It's a machine. And I didn't buy this chain to run a factory." He turned to Paul. "You've got something to say, Paul?" Paul cleared his throat, his voice strained. I was just doing my job. Keeping standards. You can't let everyone in, or this place turns into a flop house." A few employees nodded, but most stayed silent. Robert's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained calm. "Standards don't mean turning away people who don't fit your idea of classy. They mean treating everyone with dignity. You failed that test, Paul, but I'm giving you a chance to fix it. Step up or step out." Paul's mouth opened, then closed. He nodded stiffly, but his eyes burned with resentment. Over the next few days, the hotel became a hive of activity. Robert worked alongside the staff, rolling up his sleeves to help with everything from checking in guests to reviewing training materials. He sat with Clara and a small group of employees, sketching out ideas for a new employee feedback system. He met with guests, listening to their stories, older couples who felt ignored, families who sensed judgment from the staff. Each conversation fueled his resolve. But not everyone was on board. Paul, though outwardly compliant, undermined the changes behind the scenes. He muttered to loyal colleagues about Niro's ego trip and scoffed at the new policies. Linda, desperate to redeem herself, overheard him one evening in the break room. "He's going to ruin this place," Paul said to a porter, his voice low but venomous. "Letting in every bum off the street will be a laughingstock." Linda, clutching a coffee mug, hesitated. She remembered Robert's words about speaking up. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "That's enough, Paul," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're the one who got us into this mess. If you can't change, maybe you don't belong here." Paul's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway, her eyes flashing. "She's right," Clara said. "We're trying to make this better, and you're just making it harder. If you've got a problem, take it to Mr. Niro." Paul stormed out, leaving a heavy silence. Linda and Clara exchanged a look, not quite friendship, but a shared understanding. They reported the incident to Robert, who listened quietly, his face unreadable. The following week, a local news outlet ran a feature on the Grand River's transformation. Titled "De Niro's Stand," a Hollywood star takes on prejudice. It detailed the confrontation and the changes that followed. Older Pittsburghers, sipping coffee in diners or reading papers at breakfast tables, were captivated. "About time someone showed those high-end mighty types what's what," one retiree told a reporter, her eyes gleaming. The story resonated with those who'd faced judgment for their age, modest means, or unpolished appearance. But the spotlight brought challenges. A rival hotel chain, sensing an opportunity, began spreading rumors that the Grand River was lowering its standards to cater to vagrants. Online reviews, likely planted, complained of a decline in quality. Robert, undeterred, doubled down. He invited the community to an open house, offering free coffee and tours to show the hotel's new direction. The event drew hundreds, many of them seniors, who shared stories of their own encounters with bias. One woman, a 70-year-old widow named Evelyn, approached Robert during the event. Her coat was threadbare, but her eyes were sharp. "I stayed here once years ago," she said, her voice steady. "They made me feel like I didn't belong. I never came back, but hearing what you're doing, it means something." Robert listened, his face softening. "You're welcome here, Evelyn. Always." Weeks later, the hotel was thriving. Guests praised the warm atmosphere, and employee morale had soared. Clara was promoted to a supervisory role, her quiet courage earning her respect. Linda, though still haunted by her role in the incident, had become a model employee, greeting every guest with genuine warmth. Paul, however, remained a problem. Despite warnings, he continued to resist, subtly sabotaging the new policies. One evening, Robert called him into his office. The room was small, lit by a single lamp, with a view of the city's glowing bridges. Paul stood stiffly, his arms crossed. "I gave you a chance, Paul," Robert said, his voice low. "But you're not changing. You're holding this place back." Paul's face hardened. "You think you can just waltz in and play hero? This isn't a movie. You're going to fail, and I won't be here to clean up the mess." Robert leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "You're right. This isn't a movie. It's real people's lives. And you're done here." Paul was escorted out that night, his departure a quiet but powerful signal. The staff, though shaken, rallied around the new vision. Clara stepped up, leading by example, while Linda found her voice, advocating for better guest policies. Months later, Robert stood on the hotel's rooftop, the city sprawling below. In his hand was a letter from Evelyn, who had returned as a guest and written to thank him. "You made me feel seen," she wrote, her words simple but profound. The Grand River was now a beacon of change, its story inspiring other hotels in the chain to follow suit. But Robert knew the work wasn't done. He folded the letter and looked out at the horizon. Somewhere in the city's shadows were others waiting for their chance to be heard. And he was ready to keep fighting for them, for the promise of a place where everyone belonged. And for the people of Pittsburgh, especially those over 55 who'd lived through their own battles with prejudice, it was a story that felt like triumph. The Grand River Hotel stood tall against the Pittsburgh skyline, its faded elegance now infused with a new vitality. Spring had arrived, and the March air carried the scent of blooming dogwoods and the faint hum of the city waking up. Inside, the lobby bustled with guests, families, business travelers, and locals drawn by the hotel's growing reputation as a place where everyone was welcome. The chandeliers still buzzed faintly, but the worn carpets had been replaced with warm, inviting patterns, and the staff smiles were genuine, not forced. Robert De Niro's stand against prejudice had transformed the hotel, but the journey wasn't over. The final chapter was about ensuring that change would last. Robert had spent months at the Grand River, far longer than he'd planned. Between film projects, he'd made Pittsburgh his temporary home, working alongside the staff to cement the new culture. The story of his confrontation with Paul and Linda had become local legend, shared in diners and church basements across the city. For Pittsburghers over 55, it was more than gossip, it was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the powerful could be held accountable. They clipped newspaper articles, shared Brainiacs posts, and told their friends. De Niro showed them what's right. Inside the hotel, the transformation was tangible. Clara, the young housekeeper who dared to speak up, had been promoted to guest relations manager. Her quiet strength and empathy made her a natural leader, and she'd become the heart of the staff. Linda, the receptionist who'd once sneered at Robert, had undergone her own redemption. Haunted by her role in the incident, she'd thrown herself into the new training programs, learning to see guests as people, not stereotypes. She now greeted everyone with a warmth that surprised even herself, her once perfect hair often loose, a sign of her shedding her old rigidity. Paul, the former shift manager, was gone. His firing had been a turning point, a clear message that resistance to change wouldn't be tolerated. But Robert hadn't stopped there. He'd implemented a system for anonymous employee feedback, ensuring no one felt silenced. He'd also introduced a guest outreach program, inviting locals to share their experiences and ideas. The open house he'd hosted had become a monthly event, drawing crowds of seniors, workers, and families who felt the hotel was now theirs. Yet challenges remained. The rival hotel chain's smear campaign had quieted, but whispers persisted online, claiming the Grand River had gone downhill. Robert countered with transparency, sharing the hotel's progress on X and local news. Guest reviews began to drown out the critics, praising the staff's kindness and the inclusive atmosphere. One post from a 62-year-old steelworker named Tom went viral. Took my wife to the Grand River for our anniversary. Felt like royalty, not judged for my old jacket. De Niro's the real deal. On a crisp morning, Robert gathered the staff for a final meeting before returning to New York. The conference room was packed, the air tinged with the scent of fresh coffee and pastries from the kitchen. Clara stood beside him, holding a folder of proposals she'd drafted. Linda sat in the front row, her notebook open, ready to take notes. The employees, once divided, now felt like a team, their faces reflecting pride and purpose. I came here as a guest and was turned away, Robert began, his voice steady, carrying the gravitas of a man who'd lived 1,000 roles but spoke from the heart. But I stayed because I saw something worth fighting for. You've all shown me that change is possible, not just in this hotel, but in how we treat each other. He gestured to Clara. Clara, you've taken the lead in ways I couldn't have imagined. Your ideas, guest welcome packets, staff support groups, community partnerships are the future of this place. Clara blushed, but stood taller. Thank you, Mr. De Niro. But it's not just me. It's everyone here. Robert nodded, his eyes sweeping the room. She's right. You've all stepped up. Linda, you've turned your mistake into a strength. That takes courage. And to the rest of you, kitchen staff, porters, housekeepers, you've made this hotel a home for people who thought they didn't belong. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I'm leaving tomorrow, but this isn't the end. I'm putting Clara in charge of implementing the new programs across the chain. And I'm setting up a fund for employee training and community outreach. This hotel will be the model for every Grand River property, from Pittsburgh to Portland. A ripple of applause broke out, growing louder as the staff rose to their feet. Linda wiped a tear from her cheek, and even the gruff head chef, who rarely spoke, clapped with a grin. Outside, the crowd, now a regular fixture of curious locals, cheered, having caught wind of the meeting through X. But before I go, Robert added, his voice softening, I want to hear from you. What's next? The room buzzed with ideas. A porter suggested a scholarship for local kids to learn hospitality skills. A cook proposed partnering with food banks to donate leftovers. Linda raised her hand, her voice steady. What if we created a guest ambassador program? People like Evelyn, who shared their stories, could help us spread the word and keep us accountable. Robert smiled, a rare, unguarded expression. That's it. Keep those ideas coming. This is your hotel now. That evening, Robert hosted a final open house. The lobby was alive with laughter, the clink of glasses, and the hum of conversation. Seniors from nearby neighborhoods mingled with young families, their faces glowing under the newly polished chandelier. Evelyn, the widow who'd once been made to feel unwelcome, arrived in a new coat, a gift from Clara. She approached Robert, her eyes shining. You changed this place, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I brought my grandkids tonight. They're proud to be here. Robert took her hand, his grip warm. You're the reason we did this, Evelyn. Thank you for coming back. As the night wound down, Robert slipped out to the rooftop, needing a moment alone. The city sprawled below, its bridges glowing like threads of light. In his pocket was a letter from Clara, written on behalf of the staff. You gave us a voice, it read. We won't let you down. He thought of the people he'd met, Clara's quiet courage, Linda's redemption, Evelyn's resilience. He thought of the older Pittsburghers who'd embraced the story, seeing in it their own struggles against judgment. The Grand River was no longer just a hotel. It was a symbol of what could happen when someone refused to accept injustice. The next morning, Robert stood outside the hotel, his suitcase at his side. Clara, Linda, and a small group of staff gathered to see him off. The crowd of locals, now familiar faces, waved from across the street, holding signs that read "Thank you, Bobby," and "Grand River Forever." Clara stepped forward, her eyes misty. You'll come back, right? Robert chuckled, the sound warm and grounding. Try keeping me away. You're in charge now, Clara. Make it count. He turned to Linda, who stood nervously. You've got this, he said simply. She nodded, her smile genuine. As his car pulled away, the crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the morning air. Robert looked back, the hotel's sign glinting in the sunlight. He knew the work wasn't finished. Other hotels in the chain awaited, each with its own challenges. But the Grand River had shown what was possible, a small step that could spark a movement. Back inside, Clara gathered the staff, her folder of proposals open. Let's get to work, she said, her voice steady. The team nodded, ready to carry the torch. Across Pittsburgh, seniors shared the story over coffee, their voices filled with pride. Niro did it, they said, and we're not done yet. The Grand River's legacy was alive, a quiet revolution that promised a world where everyone had a place. And for those who'd felt invisible, that was a victory worth celebrating.